Wisdom shines in talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. My comments bring this profound wisdom into your experience. Use YouTube's closed captions to read along. A sannyasi asked, it is said that the self is beyond the mind, and yet the realization is with the mind. And then he gives a quote from the Kena Upanishad: the mind cannot think it. It cannot be thought of by the mind, and the mind alone can realize it. How are these contradictions to be reconciled? He asks. And Maharshi says, Atman is realized with a dead mind, that is, a mind devoid of thoughts and turned inward. Then the mind sees its own source and becomes that. It is not as the subject perceiving an object. When the room is dark, a lamp is necessary to illumine and eyes to cognize objects. But when the sun is risen, there is no need of a lamp, and the objects are seen. And to see the sun, no lamp is necessary. It's enough that you turn your eyes towards the self-luminous sun. Similarly, with the mind, to see the objects, the reflected light of the mind is necessary. To see the heart, it is enough that the mind is turned towards it. Then the mind loses itself and the heart shines forth. Now, Ramana Maharshi explains that the self, though beyond the mind, can be realized with a mind that is devoid of thoughts and turned inward. This fits an ancient Indian yogic idea that you become what you think. You become what you focus your mind upon. When the mind becomes still, it sees its own source and becomes it. It merges with the self and becomes one with it. This is self-realization. This realization is not like an object being perceived by a subject, but rather it is a merging of the subject and object into one. It is more a dissolving than a merging. The mind dissolves into the self. Ramana Maharshi gives the analogy of a dark room where a lamp is needed to see objects and eyes are needed to perceive them. However, when the sun rises, no lamp is needed, and objects are seen directly in the light of the sun. The sun, though, doesn't need any other light other than its own. It is self-luminous. When the mind looks at objects, it needs some external light to illumine the objects. But when the mind looks within, when the mind is turned towards the self is illumined by its own light of knowing. The self knows the self. Then the mind loses its imagined individuality, and the self shines forth, just as the sun shines without the need for a lamp. To reconcile the apparent contradiction that the self is beyond the mind and yet realized through the mind, you must understand that the mind must become still and turn inward to know the self. When this happens, it is not that the mind merges with the self, but rather the mind is dissolved by the self. The mind has a job to recognize and differentiate all the separate objects in relation to your separate individual self. But when you know all this as one, there are no more separate objects. And so there's no more job for the mind. This realization is not a mental concept, but a direct experience of the self once the mind has gotten out of the way. So it is like both are true. The mind is an impediment to knowing the self, obscuring it with mental projections and imaginations, and the mind is the doorway to the self, opened only by a quiet mind diving into the self. Ramana Maharshi emphasizes that the self cannot be grasped by the mind or any mental concepts. It is beyond the limitations of the mind and only can be realized through direct experience. That's why he says that, quote, the mind cannot think it, and it cannot be thought of by the mind. These videos help bring Ramana Maharshi's teachings into your direct experience. Subscribe now to help you deepen your understanding and practice to know the self. Just click the subscribe button.